Hi guys, this is Nadia from Ibali Crafts and I'm super excited to show you my first installment of my Here Be Dragons tutorial series. I will be writing PDF tutorials which will be uploaded to my shop, but I'm also going to film free tutorials for my YouTube channel. So don't forget to hit the subscribe button to get notifications of the latest uploads. I'm also going to be offering kits for these awesome focal stones. So if any of you want to get your hands on one of these, I'll pop the link again in the description and you can take a gander over and see if there's anything you fancy. As always, you're very welcome to come and join us in our Facebook group. It's called Wire Wrap and Metalsmith Artists Worldwide. We're an awesome bunch with loads of inspiration and the people in it are absolutely awesome. So come join us. Right, that's all the sales bumped out the way. Let's get started. So this kind of design calls for some really thick wire. This is 1.6 mil, which is your 12 gauge. And you really should be using some heavy duty cutters. But if you don't have those, I'm going to show you how to cut this thick wire with some finer pliers. So I'm taking my really fine Tronics pliers, and all I'm doing here is I've put a little nick in the wire, just a very slim one, so it doesn't damage my pliers, but because it doesn't have great shear strengths, the wire breaks really quickly. So if you don't have any heavy duty pliers, you can cut it this way. So the next step is obviously to warm it up and make it a bit more malleable, because obviously at this stage it's quite difficult to manipulate. So you need to have it nice and straight and warm it up, which makes it a bit easier to work with. So I am leaving about, I think, a third of the length towards the right, and I'm shaping the initial shape. It's going to be a V shape. So I've put a little bend in the bottom, and then I'm shaping it using my fingers just very roughly to start with, to get the initial sort of form shape right. And then the next step is to create the first wing. So I am using my pliers and I'm pushing the wire around itself and I'm bending it downwards, and then I'm using the pliers to press the wire back in on itself. And you can see, because the wire is quite thick, it's quite difficult to manipulate. So put your fingers over it when you're pushing things together, otherwise it kind of flips on its sides. I'm not really sure how to explain it, but you'll see what I'm talking about. So shape it and use your pliers to kind of help you along with that. There isn't much else you can use, no other tool, because we're not really going around an object or anything like that. So you're just going to have to manipulate the wires with your pliers. So next I'm putting a bend in the bottom, and when you're putting in that bend, take into account that the actual bend itself will take up some wire and some space. So you need to leave a couple of millimeters to the right when you put the bend in to account for the size of the wire, and that will take up some space. So that's what it looks like roughly. So the next step is to create a seat for the bead. Now you can use any kind of bead for that, bigger, smaller, one with a hole or one without. So this is what it's going to look like. So we're just going to create like a swirl. And this is the reason why the wire has to be as thick as it is, because obviously it needs to stay put. It's quite an open design, so you don't really want it to be able to be pulled apart. So I'm going to start off by holding the wire with my pliers at the base. This gives you, it should actually use some slightly wider pliers to have more grip, but this worked for me, so you can see whatever works for you as well. And all I'm doing here is I'm going in an anti-clockwise swirl. So you'll have to manipulate the wire and really just take your time with that. The slower you go, the more control you have over the wire, especially, as I said, when it's thick wire, thick gauges like this, you need to take your time with that and guide it with your hand and fingers. And you'll need to cross the V-shaped wires twice in order to get the first spiral seated. And it will be difficult to manipulate because obviously this is quite a thick gauge, but once you get an idea of feel for the wire, it gets easier. So next, the next step is a little bit fiddly. I know some people think this is quite funny, especially from our friends across the pond, because fiddly is it's kind of a funny word, so I'll use it for entertainment purposes. So going to place the bead in the little coil we've created, and you need to kind of keep a hold of the bead, which proves a bit tricky at this stage, but bear with me, it will stay in place eventually. So keep a hold of it, and she says better said than done. And what we're going to do next is, there you go, pops out, and then we try and keep hold of it, and we need to place the wire over the top and create a coil right at the top of the bead to keep it in place. So use your thumb, and as you see, it doesn't want to stay put, but eventually it will. And then we're just going to use our fingers and press the wire down as you curl, so that way you create tension. It's kind of like a press fit almost. So that's it. Tension setting. And then you can manipulate the setting. Once you're done, you can kind of adjust the way it sits. You want to make sure that the curls, both on top and the bottom, are kind of parallel to each other to give it a kind of neat and symmetrical look. So I've adjusted it, and the next step is to create the swirl at the top, which I thought that looked kind of like a flame a little bit, so I kind of like the idea of that. So we're bending things in place and make sure it's symmetrical as much as we can. So I'm adjusting the one side first. It always helps to get a better perspective when each side, well, I find anyway, when both sides are kind of symmetrical, it helps me with the rest of the design, if that makes any sense. So I adjust everything as much as I can. So next we're going to put a little bend at the top, and we're going to create a sort of a decorative swirl. So I'm straightening out my wires again, and I'm going to trim off a small section because it's slightly too long. You'll get a feel for how much wire you need to trim off when creating swirls. And here I'm using my heavy duty cutters, but as I showed you earlier, you can also use your non-heavy duty cutters if you don't have these. So the next step is to create a swirl. So that's long enough to create a short swirl. If you wanted to create a tighter swirl, you would have to use more wire, but we're only going to create a very open one. So next step, I'm using the base of my round nose pliers to thin out the tip, and that, as I keep saying, thins out the sort of point of the swirl and gives the nice sort of elegant finish, rather than the abruptly cut wire when you cut the wire and it just stops. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, so I'm going to thin it out, and then I'm going to very slowly curl the wire in on itself. And that just, again, one other thing, that take your time with that, as I said, especially with thicker wire, do it slowly, and then come in and adjust the swirl. If you don't like the size and shape of it, you can very easily adjust it with a pair of pliers. I really should be using some pliers with a wider nose. The fine tips aren't really good for that. So if you have anything like a flat nose pair of pliers, that's better than these, because they don't have much grip on the tips, so, and they're not very strong for that sort of thing, for that kind of wire. So keep adjusting it until you're satisfied, and so far that's where we're at. So I've adjusted a little bit, and the next step is to get a symmetrical right side wing. So I'm using a ruler to determine, not so much to measure, but more to determine the parallel level. And I am going to bring in my pair of pliers and then fold the wire forward. Remember, take into account that when you bend the wire, you need to leave a millimeter or so at the top to account for the wire thickness when you're bending it over. But the wire is actually quite forgiving at this stage. As long as you don't nick it, you can unbend it once or twice without breaking it. It does become very brittle very quickly if you do this too often. So as long as you don't bend it too tightly, you can readjust. You can see me here, I'm placing my pliers in the sort of elbow, and that kind of extends the curve, if that makes sense. So I'm kind of lining it up with the other side, and if I'm not happy, I'm opening it up again, and I'm pressing in. Sorry, I'm out of shot here. I'm pressing into the elbow, and I hope you can see that, and it elongates the actual curve before I decide and bend it. And actually here I've messed it and it's a little bit too short, so I am adjusting it. It's not bent flat yet, so you still have a chance to fix it somewhat. I'm just leaving this, I mean, so that you can actually see that you're able to adjust it even if you have already put a slight bend into the wire. As long as it's not completely doubled over, you can do that. So here I'm pressing, and then once I'm satisfied, I am going to close off the actual bend itself, and it's still not lined up properly. There's still other ways you can fix it. If the one side is too long, you can change the elbow or the bend at the bottom to fix it, which is what I've done so far. So now I've adjusted it some more, and now it's kind of symmetrical. It just takes a little bit of fiddling here it is again, until you get it right. So the next step is to create the little loop at the bottom, and we're going to do away with that wire. And I wanted in this design to be, for every single wire to be on the same plane, so that nothing sticks out. So I'm creating a swirl here, which I'm going to adjust until it actually fits into that little gap at the bottom. So again, you can see me use my pliers, and you can see you can do this whole design with just one single pair of pliers. All the way through. These ones are actually some of my favorite pliers. They were really cheap, something like £5 or something like that on eBay, and they're super strong. As I was saying the other day in the group, they are probably as good as any of the really expensive pair of pliers I have. I really like them. I'll pop a link in the description as well, or a name at least. I think they're called precision pliers or something like that. Anyway, I'll stop talking about them now and talk about the tutorial. So we're going to press the loop in place until it actually fits into that gap at the bottom. And again, take your time with this. You don't want to, if you press too hard, you're going to slip and you can injure yourself. And you can also mark the wire, which you really want to try not to do. You can polish it out in the end, but the slower you go, the less chances of you marking your wire. So now once that's done, we're going to harden the whole design, because obviously it's open, it's not really attached, so it's a bit flimsy. We want to make sure that it's nice and stiff, and I'm going to hammer each wing until I'm satisfied with the width and the way it's been flattened. So you can do the same as well. You can flatten it as much as you want. One trick with the hammering is that you always keep your finger over the two areas, because obviously when you're hammering, the wire expands. So the best option is, here you can see my thumb here on my left hand is holding both pieces of wire so that it can't expand, and I'm going to keep hammering until I'm actually satisfied with the width. So another thing with shaping the hammered area is that you need to direct the blows into the direction you want the wire to expand to. I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to do the same with the tip, and I'm going to use the ball side of my chasing hammer to get into the small areas. And remember, if you don't want any markings to show from the front, you need to hammer this section from the back. So depending whether you want to have sort of an organic look, you can hammer the front. If you want it smooth, you hammer from the back to get different sort of textures of the wire. And so far so good. That's what it looks like. Next step is add the beads. I've already done one side so you can see what it looks like. So this is 0.6 wire, and I'm going to feed it through the wing on the left, and I'm going to just wrap it around the outer wire just 2 or 3 times, because obviously there's no gap, and we can't push it all the way up because there's not enough space because the wire is folded over. In retrospect, I should have maybe left a loop or so, but I like the look of this better. So we're going to shift it up as much as we can to the top, and then we're going to wrap it around. So the reason why we've attached it around the outside wire is so that the whole thing doesn't just slip off the wing, because if we're only just wrapping it around both wires like I'm doing here now, it would just simply slip off. So now I've wrapped it around, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to wrap or wind these 2 sections together so that they are joined and the top section can't just slip off. So I'm twisting these together, and again, be careful here not to mark your wires. If you press too hard, it'll just simply break, make the wire brittle, so be careful when you're using your pliers. So pressing it down, and next is I'm going to add my beads here. I've got I think it's 2, 3 and 4, or 3, 4 and 5, I'm not too sure, I need to double check that. So I'm adding these in. Again, obviously this is personal preference. I'm only just doing this. You could leave it completely open. I just don't like leaving open ends because they very easily get hooked on things, and then the whole thing bends out of shape, and that would be a shame if you put lots of work in it and this would happen. So I try and tend to close off any sort of snagging bits and pieces so that this doesn't happen. So next, all I'm doing here to tie this off, I'm wrapping the wire around itself next to the beads, and this is just so that it's kind of tied off and there's no loose end. And I'm pulling this tight so that you can just trim off the wires. Obviously going to do the same at the bottom here, and then I'm going to trim off all the wires. And that's the whole pendant done. So I hope you're going to join me for the next installment, and thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to pop over to my shop to see if there's anything that you'd like. I've got kits, other PDF tutorials, square, half round wire, beads, all sorts of stuff. And I would absolutely love to see you pop over onto my Instagram, Facebook or TikTok, all found under Embodied Crafts, and obviously in our group. You're very welcome to come and join us. Thank you so much for watching, and I see you soon.